if we have a gap in our background knowledge, that doesn't mean that God can't speak to us until we've got a PhD in Second Temple Judaism. The basic big fat messages of the Bible, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, etc., those will shine through even with comparatively little understanding. But pretty soon, if you read even a book like John's Gospel, where that famous quote occurs, people will start to say, hang on, what did they understand by a Messiah? And who were these Pharisees? And how did they view the temple? And why was what Jesus did in the temple so explosive? If we don't do the history, we will commit massive anachronisms. We will imagine that they were just like us, except without cars and electronic toys.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Welcome back to Theology Curator. This is Kurt Willems. I'm excited to be with you today because today, my friends, we are talking with NT Wright, the bishop, the professor, the pastor, the guy who writes all of those books. And he has two that are pretty new right now. One is called History and Eschatology, Jesus and the Promise of Natural Theology. And this is actually a kind of picking up of some lectures he did in 2018 called the Gifford Lectures. And so we'll briefly touch on that in this episode and conversation, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of that since that's one of his latest works that is out right now and worth checking out. And apparently he did the first set of lectures on this topic of natural theology, the Gifford Lectures, since Rudolf Bultmann back in 1955. So it's a pretty significant lectureship to take up here so many years later. The main topic of conversation, however, is going to be centered around his latest work, co-authored with Michael Bird, another friend of this podcast. And this book is massive. I mean, this thing is like holding a study Bible when you hold it. It's got color, it's beautiful, it's just well put together. Zondervan put it together, in fact, and it is called The New Testament in Its World, an introduction to the history, literature, and theology of the first Christians. And I want to say that this is really, if you are wanting to go a step beyond NT Wright in popular format. So let's say that you're someone who has read Simply Jesus. You've read some of his other really popular books, maybe his new Paul book that we talked about a while back on this podcast, and that's been your exposure to NT Wright. But you've always thought, one day I'm going to read the nerd stuff. I mean, the real nerd stuff, these big, big books, this Christian Origin series that he has that is really written for seminary and beyond. Well, here's the deal, my friends. This volume is actually a compilation in many ways, not just a mere compilation, but a step into that world for students. There's a section in this book on every major academic volume that NT Wright has put out, from Paul and the faithfulness of God to the New Testament and the people of God and all of the volumes in between. And so, my friends, I want to invite you to listen to this conversation. I think you are going to find more than just a commercial for his new books. In fact, what I think you're going to find is we're going to get to the heartbeat of some of the things that make NT Wright really tick. And my friends, I really believe that that will be something that enriches you and helps you follow Jesus in more intelligent and humanizing ways. Right before we get to that, let me just remind you that there is a newsletter that is connected to many of these podcasts, and you can get to that newsletter at theologycurator.com/newsletter. theologycurator.com/newsletter. Well, friends, let's get into the conversation. I want to welcome you all back to the podcast, and I want to welcome Professor NT Wright back as well. Great to have another chance to chat with you.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be with you.
Awesome. Well, I know a lot of my listeners are going to be really excited to get to hear from you about yours and Michael Bird's new volume that just came out. But I was kind of thinking, before we get too far into that, would love to just get a general update. How are things going? I know you're usually working on several projects and supervising doctoral students, which I think I've heard is sort of kind of moving towards a phase out. I sense there's a transition happening in some of your life.
That's exactly right. Yes, indeed. I turned 70 last December and had quite a strong sense that it was time to step down or back or whatever you want to say. But I'm doing this in phased movements, and at the moment I'm sort of semi-retiring. I'm going down to a quarter time in St Andrews, which will be partly supervising my 4 remaining PhD students and also partly helping with the editorial work for a wonderful new project at St Andrews, which is called the St Andrews Encyclopedia of Theology, which is going to be a free online resource available worldwide on the net. And
Wow.
We hope that this will be a major resource for theology worldwide in the coming generation.
Wow, that's huge.
Meanwhile, my wife and I have, it is huge, yeah. Meanwhile, my wife and I have just moved house to Oxford, where we are living right in the middle of town. It's very exciting. It's close to everything. It's 5 minutes walk from the Bodleian Library, one of the great libraries of the world. And that's been quite stressful. There's, as always with moves of house, there are things that don't happen that should and things that do happen that shouldn't, and so on. But I hope that by Christmas we'll be more or less straight and have the family around and be able to celebrate being there, because we're much, much closer to family, which is a great blessing, and especially to be close to the grandchildren.
I'm sure.
So that's all happening. And meanwhile, I'm on this road trip publicizing this book by Mike Bird and myself. And also, I should say, the other thing I'm doing is publicizing my new book with Baylor University Press, which is the Gifford Lectures that I did last year, entitled History and Eschatology. And I'm really excited about that as well, but I haven't actually seen too much publicity for it at the conference yet. But I'm expecting that will emerge. Oh,
that's really exciting. What, in short, were you aiming at doing in those lectures, and how does the book kind of fit into kind of that project?
Well, the Gifford Lectures are about natural theology, and part of the question at the moment is, what do we mean in today's world by natural theology? You know, traditionally that is looking at the natural world apart from the Christian revelation and seeing what you can deduce about God from it. The problem with that project is that Jesus himself, if we believe that he was fully human, Jesus himself is and was part of the natural world, and we ought to be able to include Jesus in the study, which means the study of history, which again, traditional natural theology hasn't been very good at factoring in, doesn't know what to do about history. So I have been trying to say, hang on, let's hold this stuff together and see what happens. And so I do a major run on what exactly is history and how do we do it, and then what happens when we do this with Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been really exciting. And so I hope that book is going to make a bit of a splash. That's History and Eschatology, which is an echo of the Gifford Lectures, which Rudolf Bultmann did in 1955. He was the last New Testament scholar before me to do the Gifford Lectures, which is truly extraordinary.
Right.
So it's kind of continuing the conversation as half a century later.
That's really extraordinary. I think now that you say it, I think I actually listened to the first, maybe second session that you did there. And I remember that now, that you continued something that had been on hiatus.
It's been, I did a lot of further editorial work. I mean, I gave the lectures and then got a lot of very good feedback from friends and colleagues. And on the basis of that, I wrote them up so that the published version is maybe 2 to 2.5 times as long as the original lectures, with quite a few interesting bells and whistles added and or taken away in the light of correspondence and criticism and so on.
So 2 books out, in the same couple of weeks here. And my goodness, I have the The New Testament in Its World, an introduction to the history, literature, and theology of the first Christians. And I think what's really fascinating to me, and I want to get into some of this, is the way that a bunch of your major projects are synthesized here. And maybe you'll have something to say on that in a moment. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear Michael Bird, by the way, someone I've interviewed in the past and know and really respect as well. He was instrumental in helping bring some of these things together. So talk about the birth of this project. How did this thing come to be?
It started off with a bright idea from Michael Bird about 8 or 9 years ago, actually here in San Diego at the SBL conference that year. He said to one of the publishers that we've both worked with, why doesn't somebody take Tom Wright's whole work and boil it down into a student textbook? And the publisher said, hey, great idea, why don't you do it? Together they came and spoke to me, and I said, well, if Mike's going to do most of the work, then I'm very happy about that. But what actually happened was that Mike did indeed go right through all the stuff that I've written over the last 40 years and pull it together, but also added a whole ton of photographs, timelines, date charts, diagrams, lists of particular things related to particular books. So it's a very user-friendly sort of book. It breathes at you. Every page has something going on as well as the main text. And then along with this, we video recorded quite a lot of material in Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, various places, talking about the particular issues, so that a student studying this book now has a kind of a multimedia opportunity to get to grips with all sorts of things about the New Testament in its world, as the title says. When Michael had done all that he'd done, which was a brilliant and extraordinary task, then I worked right through it from top to bottom. And it took me several months, a couple of years ago, and basically edited and tweaked and added and subtracted and in some cases rewrote whole sections, because sometimes when he was using some of my material, I was thinking, well, I'm not sure I'd say it exactly like that now. And so it was a huge task, but I think we're both very happy with it now. And Michael wrote quite a few new bits that I hadn't written anything about, like on text and canon and things like that, which was really, really helpful, and on the so-called little letters, the Catholic epistles, Peter, James, and John and Jude. He's done, I think, more recent teaching on that than I have. So it's been a really collaborative exercise. And so we've been around. We've been in Chicago. We've been. He was in Dallas. I was in New York and Atlanta, and talking about it. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, and so we're hoping that it'll really do well, both in schools and colleges and in ordinary churches where people say, well, I've been trying to read the Bible for a while, but I'm not sure I really get it yet, and so on. And the answer is, well, this book really should help.
I definitely am already sensing that as I've gotten into it in these last several days. And you mentioned something that's actually really interesting to me. I'm thumbing through it and I'm seeing there's a section on the resurrection of the Son of God and Paul and the faithfulness of God, and all of these major volumes from your Christian Origin series. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, how in the world is he going to fill space on the Catholic letters, for instance, and some of these spots that maybe you haven't done as much work that's out there.
That's why collaborating with Michael, who teaches sort of 101 courses in Melbourne, where he lives in Australia, he's been much more hands-on with that than I have recently, because I've been mostly teaching PhD students who've been mostly in one of my primary areas. So, I think it's worked really well, and I'm sitting in a hotel window now in San Diego looking down at the place where we had dinner the night when we agreed that this was a good idea.
Wow.
And so it's kind of come full circle.
That's awesome. That's really great. And kind of a piggyback on that dynamic, I'm curious. I know you often have said that, there's more volumes to be written in that series. You don't know exactly which ones you'll get to. If you were to get to another volume, is that the content area that you were hoping to cover?
Well, there is a section in this new book on the Gospels and the story of God, and that does represent roughly the area that I would hope the next volume will get to, because once you've looked at Jesus, once you've looked at Paul, then one of the big questions is, why would people in the middle or second half of the first century think that this was a good way to write about the story of Jesus? Because it's not a given that if you have somebody like Jesus, everyone is bound to say, oh, well, we must write Gospels, of course, because nobody had done this before. So the question of what sort of literature did they think they were doing and what were they trying to do with it, that's really exciting. And, of course, Richard Hayes' recent book, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, has shown us the way on that. It's a stunning, amazing book. And so I really want to pick up where Hayes leaves off and say, okay, now let's take that and build out from there. And I'm excited about that. I've got a lot of other things to do first. I'm supposed to be writing a commentary on Galatians and finishing another little book for another publisher and so on. But really, I would like to get to that big book on the Gospels.
It sounds like it's something that's still on the horizon, hopefully, which is really, really exciting stuff. I didn't remember that it was on the Gospels in particular, so that's quite great. And I'm curious now, thinking about the content of this big volume, it's basically a summary, would you say, at least the sections that highly represent your work? If someone were not necessarily new to you, but maybe haven't read the bigger books that you've written, would this be a place that they could say, hey, I can get the big ideas from those books and maybe eventually venture into them. But for now, at least I kind of have a sense of some of the more academic things you're doing there versus like, well, I think of Jesus and the Victory of God, and you had Simply Jesus, maybe a taste of that.
Yes.
So this is like a step further than something like that, right?
Well, yeah, it's a different sort of genre. It is designed very much as an educative tool so that there are specific goals in each chapter. And it says at the beginning, by the time you've worked through this chapter, you should be able to ... And there is a workbook that goes with it, which students and I hope teachers will find very helpful. And so it's really the whole casting of it is in the educational mode in a way that the earlier books that you mentioned aren't. But yeah, it is a distillation, but it's also a moving the argument forward. I mean, for instance, the section on Romans, I rewrote it from scratch because I really wasn't happy with what I had said before. And it's not that I was totally disagree with myself, but there are just ways I would put things now that I hadn't quite seen 10 years ago or whatever. So which is inevitable and right and proper. So hopefully it isn't just a distillation, it also represents a way of both of us saying, now, actually, granted where we've been, let's just take another 2 steps in this direction and see what happens. And so that's really exciting, a part of a journey.
The fact that you're still grappling with content that many people consider you to be sort of the pro at, is also an invitation, right?
Well, yeah, it is. It really should be. It really should be. And I hope people will treat it like that. And so, it's a way of inviting people to join the discourse, to join the conversation, and hopefully it'll have that effect.
I'm curious, the journey that, a lot of people come to this and they're going to be asking questions about the New Testament world. And I often get some responses that are really fascinating. On the one hand, folks are very excited about stepping into the world of Jesus and can see why that is a good starting place. On the other hand, some people have been conditioned to think that if we start getting too excited in those areas, we'll miss, and I'm using air quotes that you can't see, the Bible, or what the word really means, or whatever way you might want to think about it. And so I'm curious, how would you frame that for someone who's a little maybe skeptical about going too far into these sort of secular, and I'm using air quotes that you can't see, but you get the idea, means through which we get to the Bible?
No, I do. And I think there's 2 things I want to say which are really different but complementary. One is that God speaks through Scripture in a multiplicity of ways, and anyone who picks up the Bible and says their prayers and starts to read it I think God will honor that and will bless them and will speak to them and direct them. But part of that speaking and directing will be that God, by his Spirit, will nudge people into thinking, I don't quite understand this. I need to know a bit more about it.
Yeah.
And of course, that's happening to all of us. It happens to me when I read the Bible, and I've been reading it day by day for the last 50 years or more than that. And so there's always more to learn. But what I really want to say there is that God is not limited by our ignorances. In other words, if we actually have a gap in our background knowledge, that doesn't mean that God can't speak to us until we've got a PhD in Second Temple Judaism. Some people say that rather mockingly. Do you mean I have to have a PhD before I can understand the Bible? And the answer is no. The basic big fat messages of the Bible, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, etc., those will shine through even with comparatively little understanding. But pretty soon, if you read even a book like John's Gospel, where that famous quote occurs, people will start to say, hang on, what did they understand by a Messiah? So when people say we found the Messiah, what did they mean by that? And who were these Pharisees? And how did they view the temple? And why was what Jesus did in the temple so explosive? And if we don't do the history, we will commit massive anachronisms. We will imagine that they were just like us, except without cars and electronic toys. And they really weren't. They have all sorts of different worldview elements. And then people get worried and say, well, if you put us back in that first century world, it'll be irrelevant to the 21st century world. And the answer is no, that's simply not the case. Because when you study history, this is really the second thing to say, when you study history, you are looking at three-dimensional characters, of people who have motivations and fears and hopes and stories that they are kind of living in and that they're characters in as they see the future of themselves and their nation and their people. And we too, in the modern world, we are three-dimensional characters. And there's a real danger in flattening out the first century as though it was just a bunch of people who were worried about their spirituality or about their eternal post-mortem salvation, as though that's the only thing that's going on. And then that doesn't then speak to us, where we live in a world where we've got a lot more on our minds than that. Though, of course, the ultimate salvation absolutely matters, and the spirituality of the present matters as well, but they matter within the larger context. And this all comes down to one of the primary things which Mike and I have been banging on about on the road the last week or so, that as you look at the Jewish world of Jesus' day and say, what's it mean to put the New Testament into its Jewish world, you have Jesus saying, this is how you should pray, thy kingdom come on earth as in heaven. Earth is the place where stuff happens. It's the place of history. And it's in order to understand what it means that God's kingdom has arrived in Jesus and is arriving, that we look at history to see what that actually means.
Yeah. Wow. And that for me has been so life-changing over the last 15 years of my journey in this kind of land that you helped me see. And in fact, one of the things you're talking about history, and you use that phrase three-dimensional, and I'm curious, I think so, at least in North America, there has also been this sense that I get from some people who may, have that sense of skepticism. But when we start talking about Jesus's humanity, as long as we're talking about it in a way that feels kind of natural and relatable, Jesus was sweaty sometimes or whatever, that's safe. But one thing that's really struck me about your work is without diminishing Christ's divinity in any way, you have really helped us to see the impact of Jesus's humanity through the New Testament. And I'm curious if you might have some thoughts on why is it so important that we see the historical Jesus and his humanness alongside him being the embodiment of Israel's God, etc.
That is massively important and still massively misunderstood in many circles. And I see this the whole time. In fact, I was having lunch with a couple of colleagues who are theologians and pastors, and we were talking about this very subject, because the church from the beginning has mostly said, of course, Jesus was fully human. And there were big debates about that in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And it's very emphatic in the great statements of faith that he really was 100% genuinely human. He wasn't God pretending to be human. He was genuinely human. But to this day, the theologians who have written about that have not actually taken the humanity of Jesus nearly seriously enough. There's a recent book by quite a well-known contemporary theologian on the Word became flesh, and I'm reading it through and waiting for him to say, okay, so here's what Jesus' humanity is really all about. And it remains very abstract. It's just a sort of abstract humanity. Yes, of course he was fully human, and we acknowledge that. But without then saying, well, if he's human, he has plans, he makes decisions, he decides what to do, he figures out what to do next, and he prays to God for wisdom, to the Abba Father for wisdom as to who he should choose to be his disciples, and he has a strategy for what to do when he comes into the next village, and he particularly has a strategy for what to do when he comes up to Jerusalem for the last time. And thinking of Jesus thinking it through, if I can put it like that, which is perfectly natural if he is genuinely human, simply hasn't impinged on most people's view of Jesus, because they assume a view of God, which is that God knows exactly what to do and how to do it. So Jesus just sort of goes around on autopilot and stuff just happens around him and he doesn't have to think. And that's not the Jesus of the Gospels. The Jesus of the Gospels weeps in Gethsemane and says, isn't there another way? And in John chapter 12, which is sort of John's equivalent of that, he says, now is my soul troubled. Ought I to say, Father, save me from this hour? No, actually, this is the reason I've come to this hour. So, Father, glorify your name. And you can see Jesus as a real human being wrestling with questions and fears and doubt and possibilities that he might, after all, be deluded, which his family and his closest friends often thought he was. Really, for years and years and years now, I've been trying to explore this, and it does not detract 1 inch from saying that he really was and is the total embodiment of the God of Israel, the Creator God. And I think the problem there is that though the New Testament says that nobody has ever seen God, but Jesus has revealed him, most theologians and preachers haven't wanted to take that seriously. They've wanted to think that we actually do know who God is. We know what the word God means, and we can kind of construct this picture of God who is omnipotent and omnipresent and omni everything else, and then we try to fit Jesus into that picture, and then we wonder why that's difficult. Because, Jesus is here and not there. He deliberately doesn't go when he knows that Lazarus is ill, etc., etc. And there's all sorts of things which actually should make us think, okay, do we really know who God actually is? And if we don't until we look at Jesus, what does that mean? So I think there is much, much more still to do on this in theology, in pastoral work, in preaching, in teaching. And my hope is, naturally, that this book will help us do it.
Maybe a follow-up question. I'm curious, even Jesus does miracles. For many times in my life, I was taught, well, he's God. Of course, he does these very fancy things. That's what God does when God is on the earth. And I can affirm that in a way, but part of me wants to say, well, aren't these actually what the kinds of things someone would do fully empowered by that God as the fully human one, right? Are these actually somehow also connected to his humanity in some way?
Yes, indeed. And of course, a lot of this comes, I'm sighing deeply as I say this because it's really rather frustrating. A lot of this comes out of the 18th century when the deists in Europe and America were denying the divinity of Jesus, and so the Christians were trying to shore up a belief in Jesus' divinity, and one of the ways they did that was by saying, look, he did all those miracles, so he must be God. And of course, biblically, that's a total non sequitur. Elijah and Elisha do miracles very similar to the miracles of Jesus. Peter and John heal a crippled man in the book of Acts. Now, you can say it's in the power of Jesus, and that's certainly right, but it isn't the case that only somebody who's God gets to do that stuff. The Old Testament makes it quite clear, no, other people do that as well. And part of the problem there is that we're looking for the wrong thing, that part of the glory of the New Testament's view of Jesus is precisely that it is as God that he humbles himself and submits to the death of the cross. That's the whole point of Philippians 2, verses 6 to 11. And the clue to this, really, to cut to the chase, is in the notion of the image. Colossians 1 says he is the image of the invisible God. where does that come from? Well, Genesis 1, of course. And what it means is that when God made the world, God put into the middle of this heaven plus earth creation a human being, a pair of human beings, who would perfectly reflect him into the world and perfectly reflect the praises of the world back to him. So that the idea of being in the image is one who can perfectly embody and express who the living God is, facing outwards into the world, bringing the love and power and stewardship of God into his world, so that it is utterly appropriate for God to be a genuine human, and equally, the vocation of being a genuine human is one which ultimately only God himself can fulfill perfectly. So it ought to be a win-win, and theologians are still frustratingly trying to play the two off against one another, as though it's a zero-sum game, and the more you give to Jesus' humanity, the more you take away from his divinity, and vice versa. It simply isn't like that, though trying to explain why it's not like that seems to be really difficult in our culture, as it was in some previous ones.
Yeah, that's still a very difficult question for people to reckon with today. Yeah. So, yeah, and as I think of, this project, and I'm kind of have the table of contents open right now, and I'm thinking of the headings and your various volumes that have gone into the headings of this book. So the resurrection of the Son of God, the New Testament, and the people of God, etc. And the big book on Paul came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. It's probably maybe 7 years. It's been a little bit of time.
Paul and the Faithfulness of God was 2013. That's 6 years ago it came out.
Yeah. So knowing that those are represented in this volume, I'm curious, as you look back at your own work so far, is there one of those volumes that really for you still has kind of a deeper staying power than the others? Like, is there a volume that you just say, when I look back at what I've done, something about this particular volume and this particular set of content area gives me added joy for whatever particular reason?
Yeah, they all do in quite different ways. It's like asking which of my 4 children is my favorite.
Yep.
They're totally different characters, and I love them all, and I relish them being the people they are. It is difficult because, to run through New Testament, the people of God, which was 27 years ago now, that was written really to say, this is the basis, this is where we start, this is how we begin in New Testament, this is what the Jewish world is like. It's the stuff that I wished my students would know before they started to take the basic course, and they usually didn't, so I wrote the book to say, here you are, here's your starter kit. Yeah. But then that was really the preliminary to Jesus and the victory of God. And I still get people, somebody I didn't know at all, came up to me just an hour or two ago at the conference, and said, Jesus and the Victory of God was the book that saved my faith, and I am where I am now because of that. And I don't say that to blow my own trumpet. I'm just saying, I always think, oh my goodness, that was blood, toil, tears, and sweat, that book. And if it's done that for somebody, then I guess it's worth it. Yeah. Resurrection of the Son of God wasn't intended to be written. It was supposed to be the last long chapter of the Jesus book, and there wasn't room. But when I decided that I would make it a whole other book, that was fun to write. My goodness, exploring all that stuff. It was great. But then, of course, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, that is the book that I've really wanted to write for about the last 35 or 40 years. It's a book that goes right back to my early days in classics and philosophy, and particularly to my doctoral work on Paul, which I never published because I'd had to condense too much into my doctorate for reasons of space, and it wasn't very satisfactory doing that, and I'd always wanted to be able to spell it out properly, and now in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, that's what I've done. So they're 4 quite different sorts of books, but together they do, I hope, plunge people into the real world of the first century and say, hey, look, this is what those early Christians were on about.
You've written so much over the years and made an impact on a lot of people. And so it's fun to get kind of to the heartbeat behind some of that. And And maybe, it brings in the fact that you're not just an academic, you have a pastoral background, you're a bishop. And it seems to me that one of the gifts that you've offered in your work has been asking the question, how does this, what some people would call heady or ivory tower or whatever they might want to call it, how does this relate to the person in my congregation or parish who is a single parent trying to make do but wants to be faithful to their calling to follow Jesus there, And it's that kind of bridge that I think many have also appreciated about your work. Has that always been sort of under there for you, that you wanted to be the kind of writer?
I mean, I was preaching regularly before I started in serious academic work. I started to get invitations to preach in little churches around Oxford when I was still starting my doctoral work, as I say, and that continued. And I was ordained when I had been doing just 2 years of my doctoral program, and I was working in pastoral and preaching work then. And though that was quite often in an academic context, my own family stopped me from getting too academic, because they will very quickly say, come on, Dad, we don't know the meaning of those silly long words. Please really talk ordinary English. And they will be quite brutal about that. And so, I always have them kind of in the back of my mind, and my parents as well, who were not academics at all, but were faithful churchgoers. And I always wanted to be able to put the book on their table and say, you may have to look up a few words in the dictionary, but hopefully you'll see what it is I'm talking about. So, and there's plenty of other people in that category. The silly thing is, when I was younger, I read a lot of C.S. Lewis. I still read him a bit, a great man. And Lewis says at one point in one of his essays that any theologian ought to have to pass an exam to translate a bit of academic theology into ordinary vernacular English. And Lewis said, if you can't do that, you either don't understand it or you don't believe it. And I read that when I was very young, and I've had that in mind for the last 50 or so years. And I've always thought, no, we need to explain this in words of, well, maybe not one syllable, but making it simple, laying it out, short sentences where possible. I don't always achieve that, but that's always what I've aimed for. And then so when preaching, I try to speak as I would write in a popular way, and I try to write in a popular way as I would speak. So I'm doing that the whole time. The silly thing is, I'm an ordinary human being struggling to follow Jesus. I have temptations and fears and anxieties, and I make muddles and messes in my personal life, as everyone does. And when I'm in church, I want an ordinary old-fashioned sermon reminding me of God's grace and love and sustaining power and forgiveness. And if I want that for myself, I don't see why I shouldn't be able to preach and talk about that as well for others. And that's the kind of ordinary Christian life which we're all, if we are Christians, which we're all on. And the academic thing is like, okay, I'm looking out of a window at the moment at this amazing San Diego skyline, and I can see these huge high-rise hotels, and I'm in one myself. I know what it looks like when those high-rise hotels are going up. You have big, fat scaffolding, and scaffolding is itself a work of art, really, and it's got to be very sophisticated, because in order to build the building, you can't just put one brick on top of another. You need all sorts of stuff. And theology is like the scaffolding around the building of a church's growth or a human being's and an individual Christian's growth. And the scaffolding may not be, you may not be able to live in the scaffolding on a daily basis, but without that scaffolding, the building wouldn't get built or it would fall down. And so I say we theologians are constantly having to reconstruct the scaffolding so that the church of the next generation can be built securely. And as I look back, the whole business of sort of the academic historical background, when I was young, the average clergyman, and they were all men in those days, had lots of books on their shelves, but they would usually have Alfred Edersheim's Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, a lovely 2-volume Victorian book going through who were the Pharisees, who were the Maccabees, who was Herod, why was the temple important, all of that stuff. And clergy kind of knew that they needed to know that. They wouldn't necessarily say it all in every sermon, they probably wouldn't, but it would be in the back of their minds so that they'd be able to teach their people. Now, since the Victorian era, we have taken huge strides in our understanding of Second Temple Judaism, particularly through things like the scrolls and new editions of the rabbis and Josephus and so on. And that's the other book that everyone had in the olden days, was a translation of Josephus, because Josephus, he's a funny old stick, but he was writing about the first century in Jerusalem and Galilee, and he was there. He knew what it was like. He knew what was going on. And when you read Edersheim or Josephus, you say, well, we can do better than that now, but you don't want less than that. Without that, you'll just imagine all sorts of anachronistic things, as I said half an hour ago.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And maybe as we kind of wrap up here, because I love hearing you kind of flesh out the academic and the practical and the intertwined there. As someone who writes as often as you do, have you found that writing is, I mean, my guess is you love writing. That's a guess, and you can clarify that. But beyond that, my curiosity is, I know for some people who write, it actually becomes part of their spiritual practice. And I'm curious if that's a space you would consider a spiritual practice for you, or is it the Sunday morning, give me the normal, regular life stuff, the private Bible reading, some of those other things that I'm sure you do and know you do. How does writing fit into your life with Jesus?
Well, that's a great question. And yes, I do like writing, mostly. I mean, writing, like any other exercise, has its ups and its downs, and times when you feel you're really stuck and really can't sort it out. And then that's the time to probably to go for a long walk in the fresh air and come back and have a cup of tea and say a prayer and start again. So I'm well used to those turns and twists in the discipline of writing. But yes, it is very much part of an overall spiritual discipline. I have a regular practice day by day of reading the scriptures, usually in the morning. In the evening, it's often more contested, though I will say a prayer or the service of Compline before going to bed at night. And if possible, if the opportunity emerges, then the service of evensong. Now that we live in Oxford, there are lots of choral evensongs just round the corner from where we live, which is wonderful. So morning and evening prayer with scripture reading as the backbone of that is the heart of the whole thing. Plus the regular Eucharist. I like to be at the Eucharist every week if I can. It isn't always possible, but that's my aim and normal practice. And those together hold on to all sorts of things. But when I'm working, when I'm writing, that flows out of the life of prayer. And when I'm writing about Scripture, which I often am, then my daily reading of Scripture informs that in ways that I often don't expect. And conversely, the stuff I'm working on, as it were, as a professional New Testament scholar, will often play back into stuff that I want to pray about or preach about or work through in what you might loosely call a more spiritual fashion. So for me, it's a rich symbiosis of several different things. And it isn't that, well, that was all about my devotional life, but now this is the academic life and never the twain shall meet. The two, I constantly want the two to overlap and interlock in every way possible.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, that's such a inspiring sort of word and model for those of us who do quite a bit of writing and reflecting. And sure, it gets laborious, and yet how can all of those things come together to inform it? That's awesome. Well, hey, I really just appreciate this time being with you, and really appreciate your work as always, and hope we can talk again in this format or in another format. But thank you so much for your generosity and how much you've been putting this stuff out there for us, because at the local church level, I mean, it is making a big impact, and we're truly grateful for that.
Well, bless you. Thank you very much. Writing is a lonely task, and having that kind of encouragement is a great encouragement. Because you put the stuff out there and you don't know where it's going. And when people eventually come back and say, hey, that was helpful, I think, phew, I must have pressed the right button at some point anyway. So very good. So thank you very much. It's good to talk to you again.
Well, friends, I hope you got something really rich out of that conversation. For me, I know every time I talk with NT Wright or hear something he says or read one of his books, I know I'm inspired. It makes me think, even if I disagree with something he says or writes, I still find myself saying, I've got to reckon with this. I've got to invite Jesus into this and wrestle with it and all of that good stuff. So, hey, so glad you hung out today and listened to this conversation. Again, if you want to go go deeper with some of the content that I'm putting out there right now, the easiest way to really make sure that you're tapped into that is to simply go to theologycurator.com/newsletter, which will forward you to my newsletter archive, which houses all of the stuff that's really original content to me. And when you go there, you'll notice that we've been in the middle of a series called The Bible, and we're going to continue that series. I haven't given up on that, not even close. I'm really excited about it, actually. And so you've probably listened to some of those podcast versions here on this show, but also, of course, all of the written versions of that stuff is over there. So again, theologycurator.com/newsletter. And friends, I hope you have a wonderful season. If you're listening to this and you're an American and you're stepping into the Thanksgiving or Advent season, I hope that you just have a wonderful, wonderful time with family and friends this week and beyond. And friends, I'll look forward to more content, more episodes, more conversations with thought leaders that help us think about God, Jesus, things that matter in intelligent and humanizing ways. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.